Good evening, Saturday PM. It's a joy to be with you once again. It's been such a long time since I was last with you. I'm glad to be able to sort of share this experience with you online. I haven't had a chance to be a part of the experience of Saturday PM online for quite some time. I certainly have. I've been following, but I haven't had the experience of being able to share online. We're going through the book of Leviticus. And those of you who've been with us from the very beginning, we're now at chapter 13. It's an interesting part of the book to be in. In fact, when you read chapter 13, you think to yourself, what is this doing in the Bible? And what does it have to do with me? And what lessons can I actually learn from this in the Bible? We'll read the text in a few minutes, but I just want us to quickly recap why Leviticus is such an important book. It's the third book of the Bible. It's the third book of the Pentateuch, which is known also as the Torah, the 5 books that were written by the prophet Moses. Now, Leviticus simply means, and this is from the Greek, pertaining to the Levites, or pertaining to the tribe of Levi. Now, if you've kept up with us in terms of the book of Leviticus, you know that the Levite tribe were a tribe who had been set apart by God to be priests unto God. It was the same tribe that Moses had come from as well. The same tribe that his brother Aaron, and of course Aaron's sons, had come from, and their sister Miriam. The Levites were set apart to do ministry in the kingdom, in the nation of Israel at the time, amongst the children of Israel, in a priestly order. This was important for them because it was a challenge for them to represent the people to God and represent God to the people. When we read chapter 13, you'll think to yourself, well, this is strange. Isn't this in some way something that doctors should be doing? Why are priests involved in all of this? And we'll get to understand a little bit about that in time. Now, you've already heard that Leviticus is a long book that has to do with code, it has to do with laws, it has to do with practices, it has to do with rituals. We're not going to go into any of the details with regard to that, but I do want to mention that it is important that we see Leviticus in particular as a book about God revealing himself and revealing his intentions to his people. If we understand the book of Leviticus to be doing those things, then it's much easier for us to actually read the book and try to understand what it is that God is saying to us in this book. If you look at the book of Genesis as the book, of course, of beginnings, you look at the book of Exodus as God calling out his people to himself and seeking to establish a representative group of individuals after the fall of man through the family of Abraham, and now this great nation that he has rescued from slavery in Egypt and now taking them through the wilderness to take them to the promised land. If you see the book of Exodus as God's revelation of himself to this very special group of people, and God making a commitment in chapter 25 of the book of Exodus that build me a tabernacle so that I may dwell amongst my people. I don't have to speak to them from a mountaintop. I don't have to write down laws on tablets and have them sent down. I want to be in the midst of my people. If you see the book of Exodus as that now becoming a fact, that becoming reality, from chapter 25 all the way to chapter 40 of the book of Exodus, the story of the forming and the building and the shaping of the tabernacle, and the tabernacle being the place where God's presence would abide, where God would begin this experience of dwelling amongst his people, God on earth amongst his people. A picture, if you will, of the incarnation that would happen in the New Testament. If we see Exodus as that, as God now finally saying, yes, you've set the place up just as I wanted, and I'm now going to dwell amongst my people, then we see Leviticus as how that is going to work out. The book of Leviticus is going to now be how God reveals himself from this new location on the earth and from this place of worship, how God now is going to begin to influence all the people in the nation of Israel and ultimately to the rest of the world as well. So Leviticus has one overarching theme, and you all know it. It is the theme of holiness. It's a phrase that keeps coming up in the book, holy unto the Lord. This is set apart. This is distinct. This is different from anything else that has happened or is being used to do before. It is this outcrop or this expression of God's purpose, of who he is, how he thinks, what he expects of mankind, what he wants to do with our lives, that we should use as a lens to look at the book of Leviticus. So the breakdown you've already heard, and we're going to look at chapters 13, and later on we're going to look at chapter 14. But chapter 13 has to do with issues of skin diseases. It's as simple as that. But beyond that, it has to do with our being conscious, because it is also seen as a metaphor of our being conscious of what it means to God for us to be his representatives in a way that is consistent with his holy nature, in a way that's consistent with purity. Because God makes a clear distinction in the book of Exodus that there are certain things which are clean and there are others which are unclean. Now, being unclean is a fact of life. It is unavoidable. You're going to find yourself at some point having to handle a dead body. You're going to find yourself at some point being exposed to a bodily fluid that is going to make you unclean. Now, it doesn't mean that you are finished or there's no hope for you. In fact, the book of Leviticus has a great amount of the gracious nature of God interwoven into it, because God says there's actually a way for you to move from being unclean to be clean. And if you follow those instructions, then you can be clean and you can remain in contact with me and you can remain in contact with my people. So I'd like us to read the first couple of verses. Let's go from verses 1 all the way to verse 8 of chapter 13 of the book of Leviticus. And as I said before, you may wonder to yourself, what are these words doing in the Bible? But when you think about what I've just said, that God is looking for a way to provide for a person to go from being unclean to being clean, it will all make sense to us. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron and said, when a man has on the skin of his body a swelling, a scab, a bright spot, and it becomes on the skin of his body like a leprous sore, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons the priests, and the priest will examine the sore on the skin of the body, and if the hair on the sore has turned white, and the sore appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, then it is a leprous sore. Then the priest shall examine him and pronounce him unclean. You remember what we said about those two distinctions. But if the bright spot is white on the skin of his body and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and its hair has not turned white, then the priest shall isolate that person who has the sore for 7 days. Beginning to sound familiar? And the priest shall examine him on the 7th day, and indeed if the sore appears to be as it was, and the sore has not spread on the skin, the priest will isolate him another 7 days. We're talking about 14 days of isolation here. Then the priest shall examine him again, and on the 7th day, indeed, if the sore has faded, then it is not spread into the skin, then the priest shall pronounce the person clean. It is only a scab, and he will wash his clothes, and he will be clean. And if the scab should be all over the skin after he has been seen by the priest for his cleansing, he shall be seen by the priest again. And if the priest sees that the scab has indeed spread to the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy. Now, we all know what leprosy is. It's a debilitating skin disease. And what was keen here is that God was beginning to show the children of Israel. He was beginning to show, not just to them, but anyone who would begin to follow him, that there would be consequences for an unclean set of circumstances. There would be consequences for an unclean person to be in contact with others. God did not want leprosy to spread in the camp, and so the unclean skin disease was to be kept separate from those who were clean, those who were healthy in the camp, until it had cleared, until it had been removed. And then they would go through various rituals. If it was clear that they had been healed, they had been restored, they'd go through those rituals and they would be able to be restored to the camp. God was, in a very clear sense, a very simple way, trying to say that your hygiene, if you will, or your personal behavior will have consequences for yourself, but it will also have consequences from the people in your community. And so we have to have a set of laws that limit the spread or the influence of an infectious disease from the people, but also on the individual themselves. This could be seen as a metaphor for sin, but in the same way, it can actually be seen as a real life lesson in the importance of keeping a situation safe. In our modern day experience, all of us know, and we've had this experience no matter where you live in the world today. If a person tests positive for COVID-19, they are immediately isolated. They're isolated even if they don't show any symptoms. If after a 14-day period, 7-day period, it's clear that they don't have any symptoms, they're tested again. And if the test shows that they are negative, they're allowed to come back into general society, of course keeping with the practice that you and I expect of socially distancing, covering our mouths, and making sure that we are not helping the spread of the infection anymore. The same model, the same idea here in Leviticus chapter 13. Now, from verse 9, we see another interesting development. When the leprous sore on the person, when the leprous sore is on a person, then he shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall examine him. And indeed, if the swelling on the skin is white and has turned the hair white, and there is a spot of raw skin in the swelling, it is an old leprosy of the skin of his body, and the priest will pronounce that individual unclean and shall not isolate him, for he is unclean. And if leprosy breaks out all over the skin, and the leprosy covers all of the skin of the one who has the sore from head to foot, wherever the priest looks, then the priest shall consider, and indeed if the leprosy is spread all over the body, he shall pronounce that person clean, who has the sore. It has also turned white, he is clean. But when the raw flesh appears on him, he shall be unclean. The priest shall examine the raw flesh and pronounce him to be unclean. And if the raw flesh is unclean, it is leprosy. Or if the raw flesh changes and turns white again, and he should come to the priest, and the priest shall examine him. And indeed, if the sore has turned white, then the priest shall pronounce him clean who has the sore, and he is clean. Now, here the distinction is the priest making a clear examination and making a clear pronouncement. Now, we said before, and you've seen this through the earlier chapters which spoke about the consecration of Aaron and his sons as priests, that the priests had a very, very high level of responsibility before God and also before the people. The priests were the human representatives of God to the people. So as the priests served the people, they were doing so in the name and as God's representatives. The priests were also the people's representatives to God. And they had to make sure that they kept themselves pure, they kept themselves separate from anything that would get in the way of serving God faithfully and purely. And those who did not do so felt and experienced the wrath of God immediately, as we saw in the previous chapters of Exodus, when two of Aaron's sons burnt strange fire and paid the price for it. When the priest hears from God, receives a word from God, and delivers it to the people, it is his responsibility to make sure that the people abide by what God has said. The priest cannot change what God's law requirements are. And he can only share again or represent God personally and fully to the people as the servant and the representative of God to the people. It is this challenge, it is this responsibility that the priest was to take very seriously indeed. And as such, when the priest declared, according to God's expectation, that a person was clean, that person was clean. If he declared that that person was unclean, then that person was unclean. There was no record for appeal. There was no opportunity for a change of mind. The situation was based on what God's word had declared, and it was up to God's priest, his representative, to declare what God was saying. Verse 18 goes on to talk about the boils on the skin, if that has been healed. In verse 19, we hear that in the place of the boil, if there's a white swelling, a bright spot, a reddish white, then it will be shown to the priest. And if, when the priest sees it, indeed it appears deeper than the skin, and the hair has turned white, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. So the priest was to take this responsibility of examination very, very seriously. There were factors that would lean towards a person being unclean, and there were factors that would lean towards the person is experiencing healing and therefore would be seen to be clean. Remember, it was important for a person to be clean in order to be acceptable in the presence of God. So the children of Israel were being taught that my physical well-being, my hygiene, the way in which I looked after myself was just as important as how often I came to the temple to pray, or how often I brought an offering, or how often I came to worship. All of these other areas were just as important to God and just as serious to God as how their spiritual conduct would have been conducted. We don't take this too seriously these days because we have dichotomized and we have separated our lives so specifically in modern Christianity that we only feel that God is interested in my spiritual well-being and not necessarily how I take care of my physical body. We're told in the New Testament that these bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit. They belong to God. They should be looked after. They should be preserved in such a way that honors God, that pleases God, and that is acceptable to God, that remains clean, so that our approach to God and our approach to the things of God is acceptable at all times. Now, because these two chapters, 13 and 14, deal with issues of skin and surfaces, deal with issues of infestation and affecting other people's lives by our behavior, they're important because God wanted to say to this group of people, I want you to not just be set apart in your behavior towards me. I want you to be set apart and clean in your behavior towards one another. I don't want you to infect another Israelite by your lack of hygiene or your unhygienic behavior, in the same way that I do not want you to infect another Israelite by your sinful behavior. And it is being aware of all of these requirements of God and these expectations of God, this distinction to be clean, that helped the children of Israel to live a life that was completely different from all of the other nations that existed outside of them. God makes clear there is a distinction between being clean, acceptable in His presence, and unclean, which is liable for judgment in the presence of God. The people of God, as well as ourselves, are to be aware at all times of our condition before God. And this is the challenge of the book of Leviticus. When God talks about the fact that He is a holy God and He expects holiness on our part, holiness is to be a lived out experience and not just a practice for worship. It is to be something we do on a regular basis. So holiness is going to affect how I conduct my personal life, how I keep myself hygienically clean, and how that influences other people who are around me. Holiness was not just something that would be seen and acceptable before God. It was something that would be practiced amongst the people that I have to deal with on a regular basis. And it is this holiness which was exemplified and encouraged and expected by the priests that the rest of the nation, the rest of the community, was to practice on a regular basis at every single level. It is important because, as we said before, God was not going to allow anything unholy in his presence. God was not going to allow any behavior that was unacceptable or unholy to represent him or to purport to represent him. So the children of Israel were to see themselves as being this special called out group who were to represent God at the highest levels, at every level of their lives, spiritual, social, and personal. And it is living out a clean life, living in a way that is acceptable, that is pure before God, that God expected and God demanded of his people on a regular basis. The priests were not doctors, but they were to be the godly example to encourage the people to live lives at a level that honored God. The one thing that we should never let go of from the book of Leviticus is the wonderful truth that it is not only a book of code and law and the expectations of God, but it is also a book about the grace of God. Because God would always provide a means for for whatever had happened on the body to be dealt with over time, either through isolation or through offering a gift, offering a sacrifice. Those things were God's gracious attempt and offering to the children of Israel to find a way to be clean again. There's no need for us to remain in a state of uncleanliness. There's no need for us to remain in the state of impurity before God, especially in this day today. So the rest of the chapter continues to go on talking about how the look of a particular sore on the skin, or how it has affected the body, or how it has affected that part of the skin. If it is going in the direction that it is going to lead to greater sickness, then the person becomes unclean and needs to do something to become clean. The priest had various ways in which they were to pronounce a person clean and a person unclean. In verse 45 of the same chapter, we're told how a leprous sore on the person's skin and on the person's clothes should be torn away. It should be removed. The person should cover their mouths and declare that they were unclean, and they should be isolated until the sore has become clean. They were to be kept outside the camp until the sore had been healed. In the same way, if a garment, any surface, had come into contact with that sore, had to be cleansed. There were prescriptions given in this chapter and the next one as to how it is important for that individual to remove that garment, to study the garment, make sure that the infection has not spread on the garment. If it has, they were to cut that portion of the garment away and to destroy that garment. That garment was to be burned in the fire. Verse 51 and 52. He shall examine in the wrap of the wolf, or in the leather, or in anything made of leather. If the plague is active leprosy, it is unclean. He shall therefore burn that garment in which the plague is found, whether it's warp or woof, or in wool, or in linen, or anything of leather, for it is an active leprosy. That garment is to be burned in fire. But if the priest examines it, and indeed the plague has not spread in the garment, neither in the woof or in the leather or anything that is made of leather, the priest shall command that the garment is washed, And the thing that is in the garment shall be isolated for 7 days. And the priest will come back and examine the plague if it has been washed. And indeed, if the plague has not changed color, then though the plague has not spread, it is still unclean, and it shall be burned with fire. And if it continues eating away, whether to damage, the damage is outside or inside, and the priest examines it, and indeed the plague is faded after washing, he shall tear off the part that has been fading or affected by the plague, and whether it is in the woof or in the wool or in the leather. And if it appears again on the garment, whether it is in the woof or in anything that is made of leather, it is a spreading plague, and it shall be burned with fire. So anything that is washed and shows no sign of deteriorating can be used again, but anything where the plague seems to be growing must be burned. God always gives that opportunity for something to be cleaned and to be recovered and restored, but if it is not possible, it must be burned with fire. It is pronounced unclean. So our challenge today, having read this portion, and it's a strange one in the book of Leviticus, is to recognize that despite the reality of uncleanness in the camp, there was provision for things to be made clean. And that is the trajectory that God wants at all times, that we move from a place of uncleanness to cleanliness. And that's our desire as believers even today. God bless you.